I've been working at the Millbrook Animal Shelter for about 6 years now, and I want to say up front that I'm not the kind of person who tells stories like this. I'm aware of how that sounds. Everyone who tells a story like this says something like that first. But I genuinely don't have a better way to start, because the whole reason this took me so long to talk about is that I kept waiting until I had a version of it that made sense. I don't. I've stopped waiting. My name is Daniel. I'm 34. I do intake assessments and behavioral evaluations at a mid-size municipal shelter in a mid-size town that I'd rather not name specifically. Not because I think anyone's going to come looking, but because the shelter is still operating, and the people I worked with are still there, and I don't want to complicate anything for them. None of this is their fault. The job itself is pretty straightforward, or it was. You do health checks on incoming animals, log behavioral notes, coordinate with the vet tech on anything that needs immediate attention, maintain the kennel records, a lot of data entry, a lot of walking dogs that don't want to walk, and coaxing cats out of corners. You get attached to some of them. You learn not to get too attached. Then you get attached anyway. I'd been doing it long enough that the routine was almost automatic. I knew the smell of the intake room, the way you know the smell of your own kitchen, not pleasant exactly, but yours. I knew which kennel latches needed a firm pull to close properly. I knew that the outdoor exercise run on the east side had a drainage problem and stayed muddy after rain for about 3 days. I knew the regulars at the front desk and which volunteers showed up reliably and which ones needed to be texted reminders. It was, for a long time, a good job. Meaningful, in a modest way. I liked that it was concrete. You either helped an animal or you didn't, and you mostly knew which one had happened by the end of the day. I should tell you about my brother, because that matters. His name was Owen. He was 2 years younger than me, and he died in March, about 8 months before any of this started. Car accident on a highway overpass outside of town. The guardrail gave way in a way that, apparently, it had a history of giving way, which is its own ongoing legal situation that I won't go into. He wasn't drunk. It wasn't his fault. It was the kind of death that doesn't make sense no matter how many times you turn it over, so eventually you stop turning it over, and you just carry it. Owen had a dog, a medium-sized shepherd mix named Carver, tan and black. Floppy left ear, very serious eyes. Owen got him from our shelter, actually, which was how Owen started volunteering there on weekends. He'd come in to walk dogs that needed extra time, help with adoption events, that kind of thing. He and I overlapped on Saturdays pretty regularly for about 2 years before he died. When Owen died, Carver came to me. There wasn't really a discussion. Owen didn't have a will. He was 32. Why would he? And his apartment was a rental. So there was a 2-week window where I was sorting through his things and making decisions about everything, including the dog. Carver had been staying with a friend of Owen's in the meantime, which wasn't working out. I took him. I'm telling you this because Carver is not the dog in this story. I want to be clear about that. Carver is asleep on my couch right now. He's fine. He's the most ordinary animal I've ever known, and I love him for it. The dog in this story is different. He came in on a Tuesday in late November. I remember the month because it was right around when I always start going a little flat shorter days, less to do with my hands after work. The specific loneliness of a cold apartment with one dog and no plans. My coworker Rena brought him in from the intake area, and she had this look on her face that she gets when something's not quite right, but she can't articulate why yet. Rena's been doing this longer than me. She has good instincts. The dog was a male, adult, probably 4 to 6 years old. Medium build, short coat, dark brindle coloring, almost brown-black in low light. No visible injuries. Good weight. Alert eyes that tracked you without being reactive. He was found by a couple walking along the service road that runs behind the industrial park on the north side of town. Just standing in the road, they said. Not distressed, not lost looking, just standing there like he was waiting for something. When I went to do the intake assessment, the first thing I did was check for a microchip. No chip. The second thing I did was check his collar. He had a collar plain nylon, dark green, well worn but not degraded. And he had a tag. Bone-shaped, silver-toned metal, the kind you get made at a pet store kiosk. One side had a name engraved on it, Ward. The other side had an address. My address. Not a previous owner's address, not the shelter's address. My address, my apartment number, my street, my city. The zip code was correct. I stood there for a moment in the intake room holding the tag between my fingers, and my first thought was genuinely just, someone made a mistake. That's what I told myself. The tag machines at pet stores are self-service. You type in whatever you want. Someone had typed in the wrong address. Their own address, and it happened to match mine, which is statistically improbable, but not impossible, because addresses repeat in different cities, and people make typos. I live in an apartment building. My specific unit number is not rare. I checked the address again, more carefully. Street name, unit number, city, zip. All correct. I noted it in the intake log as an anomaly. Tag lists residential address, unable to verify ownership, and moved on with the assessment. The dog, Ward, was behaviorally unremarkable. Calm, non-aggressive, good leash response, ate normally. He went into a standard kennel, and I moved on to the rest of my afternoon. I didn't call anyone about the address. There was no one obvious to call. If you find a dog with a wrong address on its tag, you don't call the address. The address is just the tag data. It doesn't mean anything by itself. What you do is post to the local lost pet boards, run the description through the database, wait for an owner to come in. I did all of that. Nothing came back. That night I went home, fed Carver, made dinner, watched something I don't remember, and went to sleep. The Ward thing had filed itself away in my brain as a strange but explicable detail, the kind you accumulate in animal shelter work, where the circumstances of how animals end up where they end up are often strange and rarely explained. I didn't think about it again until he came back. 11 days later, Ward was returned by an adopter. This happens. Animals get adopted and returned for all kinds of reasons. The adopter, a man in his mid-50s named Gerald, I remember him. I did the adoption paperwork, said Ward had been acting funny. He was not able to explain what he meant by funny in a way that gave me anything concrete to note. The dog wasn't eating? He was eating fine. Was he destructive? Aggressive? No, nothing like that. Anxious? Not exactly. Gerald kept using the phrase, "He looks at me like he's waiting." He said it twice, the second time more quietly, like he was aware of how it sounded. Ward checked out clean medically. Normal behavior markers. Back into the kennel. I checked his tag. Same tag, same address, mine. At this point, I took a picture of it. Not because I was alarmed, I genuinely wasn't yet, but because I'm the kind of person who documents things. I work in data. If something is going to be a recurring issue, you want a record from the first time. I also, and I'm not sure why I didn't do this the first time I looked up my address in our intake system, ran it as a search parameter. Nothing. No previous animals had been logged with my address as an owner contact. So the address on the tag hadn't come from our own database. I thought about how someone would get my address. I'm not particularly private. I'm on the voter registration roll. I've ordered things to that address. It's possible it's findable if someone was looking. But the question of who was looking and why they'd put my address on a dog they then abandoned near an industrial park was not a question I could answer, and I sat with it for a few days without it turning into anything useful. Then, Ward got adopted again. This was about 2 weeks after Gerald returned him. The new adopter was a woman named Teresa, mid-30s, lived in a house with a yard. She came in specifically asking for a calm, low-energy dog. Ward was a good match on paper. She took him on a Saturday. He was back 9 days later. Teresa didn't come in herself. She called the shelter line and said she'd left him tied to the post at our front entrance at 7 a.m. before we opened. She sounded tired in a way I've heard before from people who've had a bad week with an animal. Except when I asked what the problem was, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "I think he was trying to tell me something." She didn't elaborate. When I asked her to try, she said she wasn't sure she wanted to. She apologized for leaving him tied out and hung up. Ward was fine, patient, calm, exactly as I'd assessed him the first 2 times. I checked the tag again. Still my address. I don't know how to explain the shift that happened in me at that point. It wasn't fear. It was more like the feeling you get when you're driving a familiar route and you realize you've missed your turn by several miles. The quiet, vertiginous realization that you stopped paying attention at some point, and now you're somewhere you didn't mean to be. I had been treating this as a background strangeness, a minor ongoing puzzle. But 2 separate adopters had returned the same dog, both of them unable to clearly explain why. And both of their explanations, he looks at me like he's waiting. I think he was trying to tell me something were the same explanation wearing different words. And the address on the tag was still mine. That evening, I took Ward out for a longer evaluation walk than usual. I told myself it was a behavioral check. I walked him around the shelter's outer perimeter, down the side road, back through the exercise yard. He walked well. He kept pace naturally, not pulling, not lagging. When I stopped to look at something, he stopped too. And when I started walking again, he didn't need prompting. Halfway through the walk, he looked up at me. Dogs look at their handlers. That's normal. But there's usually something in it. Checking for direction, wanting reassurance, reacting to a sound. This was different. He looked up at me and just held it. Steady. No particular urgency. Like he was confirming something. I looked back at him. I said, out loud, which I'm aware was stupid, "What do you want?" He looked back at the path ahead. We finished the walk. I should tell you that I'd been seeing Owen's dog, Carver, react oddly at home around this time. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I don't want to build towards something I can't actually support. Carver was restless in October and November. Waking up in the night, standing at the bedroom doorway, occasionally staring at the wall near Owen's photograph. Grieving animals are real. Carver had lost his person. I was his person now. But I wasn't Owen. The restlessness made sense. But I noticed, the week after Ward came back the second time, that Carver had stopped doing it. He started sleeping through the night again. He wasn't at the doorway anymore. He settled. I have no explanation for why that timing matters. Maybe it doesn't. I'm including it because I promised myself I was going to include the things that felt connected, even the ones I can't prove. The third adoption happened about a week and a half after Teresa returned him. A couple, both in their late 20s, who seemed like exactly the kind of easygoing household a dog like Ward would thrive in. They had another dog. They had a yard. They had clearly done their research. They were enthusiastic in the way that experienced pet owners are, rather than impulsive in the way that inexperienced ones are. I remember thinking when they left with him, this one's going to stick. He was back in 6 days. The woman, whose name was Priya, brought him in. She was very composed about it, which stood out to me because 6 days is fast. She said Ward had been fine with their other dog, fine with them, fine with the space. But he stood at the front door, she said, every day, all day. He wasn't whining, he wasn't scratching. He just stood there facing the door. And on the 4th day, I realized he was standing in the exact same spot every single time. And she paused. I got a feeling I didn't like, and I trusted it. What kind of feeling? I asked. She looked at me steadily. Like he wasn't waiting to go out. Like he was waiting to go somewhere specific. I logged it. Returned by owner. Unsuitable behavioral match. Extended door-directed fixation. That's the kind of language you use in official notes. In my personal log, which I keep on my phone, I wrote, 3 returns, 3 adopters. Same description. Waiting. Waiting for what? I checked the tag. I hadn't touched the tag since I'd photographed it. The collar was the same green nylon. The tag was the same bone-shaped metal. I turned it over. Same name, same address. Still mine. And then I looked more carefully, the way I hadn't before, because I'd been assuming I already knew what was there. Below my address there was a second line. It was smaller, the engraving finer, and it was only visible in direct light at the right angle. I had to hold it close to the overhead light in the intake room and tilt it. It said, "He knows the way." I stood under that light for probably 2 full minutes, maybe longer. The tag was small, maybe 1.5 inches wide. And I kept tilting it, losing the angle, finding it again. The engraving was real. It wasn't a scratch or a shadow. Someone had paid to have that second line put there, which means they stood at a kiosk or mailed in a form and typed those 4 words deliberately. He knows the way. I put the tag down. I went to the staff bathroom and ran cold water over my wrists, which is something I do when I need to slow my thinking down. It sounds odd, but it works. Something about the temperature. Then I went back out and finished my shift. I didn't tell anyone that night. Not Rena, not my supervisor Mark, not anyone. Partly because I didn't have a clear way to explain why it mattered. The tag on this returned dog has a weird second line, is not a sentence that carries the weight I felt in the room. Partly because I wasn't ready to watch someone else dismiss it. I needed to sit with it first. At home, Carver was asleep on the couch. I sat next to him, and I thought about Owen. Here's what I kept returning to. Owen used to say that Carver always knew when he was coming home. Not in the general way people say that about dogs. He just hears the car explanation, but that Carver would get up and go to the door sometimes, a full 10 or 15 minutes before Owen's key was in the lock, before any sound that could have carried from the street. Owen thought it was funny. He'd text me sometimes. "Carver just told me you're about to call." And then I'd call. It became a running joke between us. I don't know why I thought about that specifically. I didn't do anything with it. I just sat there with Carver's weight against my leg and turned the phrase over in my head. He knows the way. The next morning I called the pet store chain that makes those tag kiosks. There are only 2 real brands that do them, and the tag's shape and font matched one of them specifically. I didn't expect to get anywhere. I was right. They don't keep records of individual tag orders. The kiosks are self-service. There's no camera coverage logged at the kiosk level, and even if there were, I'm not the police, and they wouldn't share it with me. The woman I spoke to was polite and unhelpful, in the way that people are when they're following policy they didn't write. I asked if there was any way to tell which location a specific tag was made at. She said no. I thanked her and hung up. Then I did something I'm slightly embarrassed about, but I'm going to include it anyway. I went online and looked at lost dog listings. Not just the local boards I'd already checked, but regional ones, statewide ones, a few of the national aggregators. I searched brindle, medium, male, shepherd mix. I searched variations. I went back 3 months, then 6. Nothing matched Ward's description in a way that felt right. No one was looking for him, or if they weren't doing it in any of the places I could see. I also, separately, searched my own address. I know how that sounds. But I wanted to see if my address appeared anywhere. It shouldn't some data broker list, some old rental listing, something that would explain how it ended up on a dog tag. I found the usual things. Voter registration is public in my state. There's an old gym membership form I filled out years ago that apparently ended up in one of those aggregator databases. My name and approximate address show up on 2 or 3 of those people search sites, the ones you have to pay to remove yourself from. None of that told me who made the tag. What it told me was that my address was findable by anyone who looked, which was either reassuring or the opposite, depending on how I wanted to read it. Ward stayed in the shelter for about 2 weeks after the 3rd return, long enough that he became part of the daily rhythm. I walked him in the mornings, noted his behavior, updated his listing. He was consistently calm. He ate well. He showed no signs of distress in the kennel, which is unusual for a dog who'd been adopted and returned 3 times in under 2 months. Most animals start showing stress behaviors by that point. He didn't. He seemed, as much as I could read it, patient. I started spending more time with him than I technically needed to. I told myself it was extended behavioral monitoring. That wasn't the whole reason. There was something about being around him that was, I want to say, comfortable. But that's not quite right. It was more that he was present in a way that felt specific. When I sat in the run with him during a break, he'd come over and settle near me. Not touching, just close. And he'd do that thing I'd noticed on our first walk, just looking up at me occasionally. Steady. No particular demand in it. I started to wonder, around this time, whether the address on his tag was less like a mistake and more like a label. Whether whoever had made that tag, whoever had left this dog on a service road with my address on him, had intended for him to end up with me. And whether the 3 failed adoptions were part of that. Whether something about Ward made him impossible to keep for anyone who wasn't the intended destination. That thought disturbed me enough that I wrote it down, and then closed the note app and put my phone in my bag. Then something happened that moved it out of the realm of quiet strangeness and into something I couldn't file away anymore. About 12 days into Ward's 2nd stay with us, a man came into the shelter. This was a Thursday, late afternoon, maybe an hour before we closed. He was older, mid-60s. I'd say gray work jacket, the kind of worn canvas that's been washed too many times. He had the look of someone who spent a lot of time outside. He came to the front desk and told our receptionist, a college student named B, that he was looking for a dog he'd lost. B called me up because I handle intake assessments, and I'd know the current population better than she would. The man's name was Carl Seaver. He described a brindle shepherd mix, male, medium build, answers to Ward. I brought him back to the kennel area. He saw the dog, and something in his face shifted, not relief exactly, more like a confirmation of something he'd expected. He crouched down and Ward came to the gate, and they had the quiet reunion of a dog and a person who have known each other a long time. I gave him a minute. Then I said, "Can I ask you a few questions before we process the return?" He looked up at me. "Sure." I asked him how long he'd had Ward. He said a while. I asked him if he lived in Millbrook. He said no. He lived about 40 minutes north, a small town called Garrett. "How did he get loose?" I asked. There was a pause that was just a beat too long. "He got out of the yard." and he ended up 30 miles south. Dogs travel, Carl said. They do, I said. I want to ask you about his tag. He didn't react visibly. He just looked at me and waited. I asked him if he had put the address on the tag. He said, I put an address on it. Yeah. I said, why my address? Carl Seaver looked at me for a moment, and then he stood up from his crouch, and his knees cracked, and he said, I think we should sit down somewhere. We sat in the small meeting room we use for adoption consultations. It has 2 chairs and a table, and a laminated binder of FAQs about pet ownership that I always mean to update. I got him a coffee from the staff machine. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He told me he had known my brother. I didn't say anything for a few seconds. He said he and Owen had met through a mutual friend about 3 years before Owen died, and that they'd stayed in loose contact. They ran into each other occasionally, had a standing habit of talking at a specific diner when Carl came through Millbrook for work. He said Owen had talked about me, that I worked at the shelter. He talked about you pretty often, actually, Carl said. He said it matter-of-factly, not sentimentally, and that made it harder to hear than if he'd been soft about it. He was proud of you, said you were the most methodical person he'd ever known, said you documented everything. I asked him how he'd heard about Owen dying. He said he'd seen the obituary, that he'd felt it badly and hadn't known what to do with that he'd had Ward for about a year at that point, and Ward had come to him under circumstances he described briefly as complicated, and that in the months after Owen died, he'd started thinking. I asked him what he'd been thinking. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. He said that Ward was an unusual animal, that he didn't mean that in a vague way. He said Ward had a way of finding people who were. And then he stopped and chose a different word than whatever he'd been about to say, unfinished. He said it the way you'd say a word you're testing out. Not sure it's quite right. Unfinished, I said. People who are carrying something they haven't been able to put down. I asked him what Ward did with those people. He thought about that for a moment. He said, he stays with them until they've put it down, or until they can't. I sat with that. Outside in the kennel, I could hear the low, ambient sound of dogs settling for the evening. The shift from active noise to quieter noise that happens around closing time. I know that sound so well, it's almost invisible to me. I noticed it then. I asked Carl what he meant by can't. He said he'd only seen it happen once, with someone else. He said the person hadn't been ready, that Ward had come back to him after 3 weeks. Ready for what? I asked. He looked uncomfortable, which was the first time in the conversation he'd looked anything other than steady. He said he wasn't sure he could explain it in a way that would land right without me having experienced it. That it was something Ward seemed to know better than he did. He said the honest answer was that he thought Ward was trying to help people who were grieving, and that the help wasn't passive, that it wasn't just comfort. He stopped there. I asked him directly, why bring him here? Why not just call me? Come find me. Tell me this directly. Carl said, because it doesn't work that way. What doesn't? It has to be the dog who arrives, he said. It has to be the dog who's returned. The whole thing has to happen on its own. He paused. If I just told you, it wouldn't mean anything. I thought about Gerald. He looks at me like he's waiting. Teresa, who thought Ward was trying to tell her something. Priya, who recognized that he wasn't waiting to go outside. He was waiting to go somewhere specific. They were the wrong people, I said. It wasn't a question. Carl nodded. But you put my address on his tag before you even knew if I'd be the one to process him. Owen told me which shelter, he said simply. And you've been there 6 years. I needed to understand how he'd gotten my specific address. He said Owen had given it to him, a long time ago, in passing, for some reason that didn't matter now. He said he'd held on to it. That when Owen died, he'd taken it out of his phone's notes and sat with it for a long time before he decided. I looked at him. I said, "You're telling me you built a plan around a dog." He said, "I'm telling you Owen wanted you to have something, and he wasn't able to give it to you himself. And Ward is the only way I know to." He stopped again. To what? He looked at the table. To open a door that should have been opened when he died. I want to be precise about what I felt in that room, because it would be easy to say I was overwhelmed or devastated and have that explain everything. It wasn't quite that. There was grief in it. Yes, hearing a stranger describe knowing my brother, describe Owen talking about me, that hit somewhere real. But underneath the grief, there was something else. Something that felt less like emotion and more like attention. Like every part of me that had been slightly background for 8 months had just come fully online. I asked Carl what I was supposed to do. He said he didn't know exactly. That in his experience, the person needed to take the dog home. Not adopt him. Not formally. Just bring him home and let what happened happen. He said he wasn't able to describe it more precisely than that, because the 2 times he'd seen it work, the people involved hadn't told him the details. They'd only told him it was over, and that they were okay. He looked at me. "The second line on the tag," he said. "I meant it literally." I looked down at the table. I thought about the 3 people who'd had Ward in their homes and brought him back. I thought about Carver settling, sleeping through the night, no longer standing at the bedroom door. I thought about Owen standing in the shelter on a Saturday with a leash in his hand, laughing at something I'd said. When I looked up, I said, "What if it doesn't work on me either?" Carl said, "Then he comes back to me, and that's the end of it." He finished his coffee. He didn't push. He sat with me in that small room while I thought, and he seemed like someone who had learned how to wait for something he couldn't hurry. Eventually, I said I needed to think about it overnight. He gave me a phone number. He said he'd come back for Ward if I decided against it. No pressure, no hard feelings. He shook my hand at the door, firm, brief, and he walked out to the parking lot and got into a truck that was older than my car and drove away. I stood at the window and watched the truck go, and then I stood there a while longer, looking at the empty parking lot in the early dark of November, and I thought about a phrase Owen used to use when something had been going on for too long. It's time to close the tab. I went back to Ward's kennel. I crouched down at the gate. He came over and looked at me in that way he had, steady, unhurried, like we were arriving at something we'd both already agreed to. I said, "Okay." I'm not sure which one of us I was talking to. I went through the proper paperwork. That felt important to me, not doing it under the table, not just walking out with him. I filled out a foster agreement, listed myself as the foster contact, noted the date and the reason, extended behavioral assessment, staff supervised foster pending reevaluation. Mark signed off on it the next morning without asking much. He trusts my assessments. That trust made me feel slightly dishonest, which I noted and then moved past. I drove Ward home on a Friday evening in the second week of December. Carver was in the back seat, which was a calculated decision. I'd introduced them at the shelter on a long lead earlier that afternoon, and they'd been indifferent to each other in the easy way that usually means coexistence is going to be fine. Not friends. Not a problem. Just 2 animals willing to share air. The drive was 20 minutes. Ward sat in the passenger footwell and looked at the road ahead through the windshield. And I had this odd awareness that he was oriented, that he knew we were going somewhere specific, that the direction mattered to him. I know that's probably projection. I'm including it because that's what it felt like. My apartment is on the 3rd floor of a building that has one of those old cage elevators, the kind with a manual gate. I always take the stairs with Carver because the elevator makes him anxious. Ward followed me up the stairs without any hesitation, at my pace. And when I unlocked the door and pushed it open, he walked in like he was walking into somewhere he'd been before. He went to the living room. He stood in the center of it and turned around once, slowly, the way a dog does when it's deciding where to settle. Then he lay down near the window, not on the rug, not on the couch, just on the bare floor near the window that faces the street, and put his head on his paws. Carver climbed onto the couch and ignored him. I made dinner. I sat at the table and ate and watched. Ward didn't do anything. He just lay there. After a while, I moved to the couch, and Carver reorganized himself to lean against my leg, and Ward stayed where he was, near the window. I called Carl that night to let him know the foster had started. He picked up on the 2nd ring. I told him Ward had settled fine. He said good. I asked him again what I should expect. He said he genuinely didn't know. He said the 2 people he'd seen go through this had described it differently from each other. He said one of them had called it a conversation. The other one hadn't used any word for it at all. How long did it take? I asked. For the first person, a few days. For the second, almost 2 weeks. And if nothing happens? Then nothing happens, he said. And you have a good dog for a while. I thanked him and hung up. The first night was ordinary. Ward slept near the window. I woke up once around 3 a.m., not from a sound, just the normal fragmented sleep I've had since Owen died, and looked into the living room. Ward was awake, sitting up, looking at the window. Not at what was outside the window, at the glass itself, or somewhere just in front of it. His ears were forward. I watched him for a moment. Then I went back to sleep. In the morning, he was lying down again, and everything was as I'd left it. The second day was a Saturday. I didn't work. I spent it doing ordinary things. Groceries, laundry, the kind of maintenance that backs up during busy weeks. Ward followed me around the apartment at a comfortable distance, not underfoot, just present. When I sat down, he settled nearby. When I moved, he moved. It felt less like being followed and more like being accompanied. In the afternoon, I took both dogs out to the park 2 blocks away. Carver ran his usual patterns. Ward walked close to me and occasionally looked up in that way he had. On the way home, walking past the small hardware store on my street, Ward stopped. Not a full stop. More of a check. He slowed, turned his head toward the store's dark display window, then continued walking. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. I noticed it because it was the first time since I'd brought him home that he'd oriented towards something other than me or forward. The hardware store window was dark. The store closed for the day. There was nothing in it except a reflection of the street. Us, walking. I noted it and moved on. The 3rd night was when something actually started. I should say first that I'm a sound sleeper when grief isn't disrupting me. And by December, I'd been sleeping better than I had in the months right after Owen died. The Ward thing, whatever it was, hadn't made me anxious in an acute way. More alert than usual, yes. Paying attention to things I'd normally let go past. But not lying awake. I went to bed around 11. I don't remember falling asleep. What I remember is waking up in the specific way you wake up when a sound has stopped rather than started, that backward awareness, where you didn't register the noise while it was happening, but your body noticed the absence of it. The apartment was quiet. Carver was at the foot of the bed, which is his normal place. I listened for a moment and heard nothing unusual. Then I became aware of a smell. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. It was faint, and I only caught it for a moment before it was gone, and it was the kind of thing you second guess immediately. But it was specific. Motor oil and cold air, and something else underneath. Something soapy, Owen soap. The particular brand he'd used since we were teenagers. A Blue Bar soap our mother had bought, and that we'd both just kept buying out of habit. I hadn't smelled it in 8 months. It was there for maybe 5 seconds. Then it was gone, and the apartment smelled like it always does. Dogs and old wood, and the particular indoor smell of winter. I lay still for a long time. Ward was not in the living room. He was in the doorway of the bedroom, sitting up, watching me. Not the window this time. Me. "Hey," I said, which was a stupid thing to say. He looked at me for another moment, then turned and went back to the living room. I didn't sleep again for a while, but I also didn't feel frightened in the way I might have expected. It was closer to the feeling of almost catching something in your peripheral vision, that specific tension of an almost thing. Incomplete, like a sentence that ended before the verb. In the morning, I didn't write it down. I decided to wait and see if it built into something I could actually describe. It built. On the 4th day, Sunday, I was going through some of Owen's things. I should explain. I still had 2 boxes of his. Mostly books, a few photographs, some paperwork I hadn't fully sorted. After the accident, there'd been a period where I processed everything I could, and then hit a wall with these 2 boxes and put them in my closet and left them there. 8 months. I'd opened the closet in front of them hundreds of times, and every time I decided I wasn't ready and closed it again. That morning I opened the closet, and I was ready. I don't know if Ward had anything to do with that. Maybe it was just time. Maybe sitting in the apartment for 2 nights knowing something was building had lowered some internal threshold. I got the boxes down and put them on the living room floor and sat down next to them. Ward came and lay down across the room. Not close, not watching me actively, just present, the way he'd been since I'd brought him home. I went through the boxes slowly. The books were mostly fiction, some non-fiction about things Owen was intermittently interested in. One period it was mountaineering, another period it was the history of rail travel. I'd given him a couple of those. I set those aside to keep. The photographs were harder. There were maybe 30 of them, loose, not organized. Some I'd seen before, some I hadn't, parties I hadn't been at, friends I didn't recognize. Owen in his early 20s, Owen in his mid-20s, Owen the way he looked right before he died. I went through them slowly and let myself look at each one. Near the bottom of the second box, I found something I hadn't put there. It was a letter, folded in thirds, unsealed, my name on the outside in Owen's handwriting. Not Daniel, just Dan, the way he always wrote it. I sat with it in my hands for a while before I opened it, long enough that Ward looked up at me once, and then looked away. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten, dated about 4 months before Owen died. I'm not going to reproduce it in full. Some of it isn't mine to share, and some of it I'm still not done with. But I'll tell you what mattered in the context of everything else. Owen wrote that he'd been worried about me, not in a clinical way, not suggesting I needed help or intervention, just that he knew me, and he knew I had a tendency to turn practical when things were hard, to document and manage and keep functioning in a way that looked fine from outside, but meant I never actually put anything down. He said he thought that was my version of the doorway thing. Standing facing the door, waiting for something without being willing to name what it was. He said he'd been trying to think of how to give me a way to name it. He wrote, "I know you won't come to me with it. You never do. You wait until it's organized enough to present. By the time you're ready to talk about something, you've already mostly solved it alone, and then there's nothing left to say. I've never figured out how to get in through that. He wrote a few other things. Then, near the end, I'm leaving this with Carl. I don't know when you'll find it. I'm hoping it'll be when you need it. I read that line 3 times. He'd known Carl would be involved somehow. He'd written this 4 months before he died, which meant the letter and the plan around Ward were already not in place, maybe, but anticipated. Owen had been thinking about this, about me and what I would need, and how to reach me in the specific way that I could be reached. I sat on the floor of my living room with the letter in my hands for a long time. Ward, across the room, had his head on his paws and was watching me with those steady eyes. I thought about calling Carl. Then I thought I should sit with it first. But something was off. I want to say that clearly, because the letter was real, and the grief it opened was real, and I don't want to undermine those things. But even while I was sitting there, even while I was reading it and letting it in, there was a part of my brain that does what it does, the methodical part, the part that documents, and it was running a parallel track. Owen had left the letter with Carl. Carl had brought Ward to Millbrook on a service road and left him there. Ward had been adopted 3 times by people who all reported the same behavior and returned him. Carl had then come in to claim him and told me a story about a dog who knew how to find grieving people and stay with them until something shifted. All of that tracked. What didn't track was, when had Owen put this letter in the box? I had packed those boxes myself. I'd gone through Owen's apartment in the 2 weeks after he died, and I'd packed his books and his photographs. I had been thorough. I am thorough. I hadn't found a letter then, and Carl had said the letter was left with him. But the letter was here, in my box, in my closet. Either Carl had access to my apartment, which should have frightened me more immediately than it did, or someone else did, or the letter had always been there, and I'd missed it, which I had to consider, even though I didn't believe it. Or I stopped that thought before it finished forming. Ward lifted his head. His ears moved forward slightly, not in a reactive way, more like an acknowledgement. I looked at him. He looked at me. And then, quietly, barely above the ambient sound of the building, I heard something. It was coming from the kitchen. Not a sound I'd describe as threatening, not a crash or a voice or anything that demanded a reaction. It was the sound of someone setting a coffee cup down on the kitchen counter. Specific. Ordinary. The particular ceramic on laminate sound of my kitchen, my counter, my cups. I hadn't moved in the last 20 minutes. Carver was asleep at my feet. Ward was across the room. Nobody was in the kitchen. I didn't move right away. That's not bravery or stupidity. It's just that my body made a calculation before I could override it. Stay still. Listen. Confirm. The sound had been singular. One placement, clean, no follow-up, no footsteps, no breathing, no secondary sound of any kind. The kitchen was visible from where I sat on the living room floor. Open layout, no door between the 2 spaces. I could see the counter. I could see the cups on the shelf above it, all of them exactly where they'd been this morning. Nothing was out of place. Nothing was different. Carver was still asleep. That detail matters to me in retrospect. Carver has a specific response to strangers in the apartment, not aggression, just awareness. A lifting of the head, a repositioning. He'd done it both times a maintenance worker had come through. He was deeply asleep. Ward was watching the kitchen, not alarmed, not stiff, just oriented, the way he oriented when something had his attention. His tail moved once, low and slow, which is not a fear response. That's a recognition response. I've done behavioral assessments long enough to know the difference. I stood up. The letter was still in my hand. I walked to the kitchen doorway and stood there and looked. Nothing. Counter clean. Cups on the shelf. The smell of the apartment, ordinary. No cold air, no displacement. Nothing that would have explained the sound. I went back to the living room and sat down. Ward had turned to watch me cross the room, and now he held that gaze, not urgently, but the way you hold someone's gaze when you're waiting for them to catch up to something you already understand. "I don't know what you want me to do," I said. He blinked, slowly, and looked toward the window. "I called Carl that afternoon. He answered on the third ring this time. I could hear wind in the background, and the faint sound of something mechanical, an engine. Maybe. Or a generator. I told him about the letter. I told him where I'd found it." There was a pause. Then he said, "I didn't put it there." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm calling." Another pause. "Has anything else happened?" I told him about the smell. The third night. The doorway. Ward sitting up watching the window. The sound this morning. He was quiet long enough that I checked my phone screen to make sure the call was still connected. Then he said, "That's more than I've seen before." "How much more?" The first person she said it was like a feeling. A warmth, she said. Very brief. Once. He paused again. The second one said he heard his name, once, and that was it. Over. "A feeling and a name," I said. "Not a letter appearing in a closed box." "No," Carl said. "Not that." I asked him if he thought the letter had always been in the box, and I'd missed it. He said he didn't know. I asked him what Owen had actually asked him to do, exactly, in detail. He said Owen had given him Ward's care as a general instruction, with the address, with the second line engraving as a specific request Carl had arranged after Owen died. He said Owen had not given him a letter. He said he had no letter from Owen, had never seen one, hadn't known Owen to be writing one. Then Owen sent it directly, I said. Carl didn't answer that. "That's what I'm saying," I said. "That's the only remaining explanation." Carl said, carefully, "I think you should stay in the apartment tonight. I think you should let whatever's going to happen, happen." I said, "That's easier advice to give than to take." He said he knew. He said he was sorry. He said he'd come down if I needed him to. I told him I'd call if I did. I ordered food that evening because cooking felt like too much. I sat on the couch and ate and watched something I couldn't focus on. And around 8 o'clock, I gave up pretending I was going to have a normal evening and turned the television off and just sat. Ward had moved from his spot near the window. He was on the floor in front of the couch now, closer than he'd been any previous night, and he was facing into the room rather than toward the window or the door. Carver was next to me. The apartment felt different. Not threatening. I want to be precise about this. It felt the way a room feels when someone has recently left it. That specific textural quality of recent presence. The way warmth lingers in a chair. I'd felt it in Owen's apartment after he died, going through his things, and I'd assumed it was grief making me assign feeling to space. Maybe it was. Maybe this was the same thing, more concentrated. Or maybe it wasn't. Around 9 o'clock, I picked up the letter and read it again. The second time through, I noticed something I'd been too overwhelmed to register the first time. At the very end, after the line about leaving it with Carl, after everything about me, and waiting until things were organized to present them, there were 2 more lines I'd read, but not absorbed. "I want you to stop waiting. Whatever you're still carrying about Mom, about me, about the whole thing, put it down. It's heavy, and you've been holding it long enough. I'll find a way to tell you when it's time." The last line. I'll find a way to tell you when it's time. Past tense would have been a comfort. Future tense would have been a vague promise, the way people make vague promises in letters. But Owen had written, "I'll find a way," present tense future. And he'd written it 4 months before he died. And either he'd known something was coming and had been preparing, which I couldn't fully sit with yet, or it was a coincidence of phrasing, and I was overloading a letter that was simply the kind of letter a person writes when they're thinking hard about someone they love. Both of those things felt partly true. I've learned that partly true is usually where you live with things like this. I folded the letter and held it. Ward looked up at me. Then he stood. He walked to the hallway that leads to the bedroom. Not all the way there, just to the entrance of it, and stopped and looked back at me. He'd never done that before. In all the days I'd been watching his behavior, he'd followed and he'd settled, and he'd oriented, but he'd never led. I looked at him for a moment. Then I stood up and followed him. He led me to the bedroom and stopped at the threshold. He sat down there and looked into the room. The room was dark. I hadn't turned the light on when I'd gotten up earlier. The streetlight came through the curtain gap at the bottom and laid a narrow orange bar across the floor. Everything was as I'd left it, bed unmade, book on the nightstand, Owen's jacket on the chair in the corner. I'd kept the jacket on that chair since October. I don't fully know why. It was a gray fleece pullover, the kind with a front pocket that Owen had left at my apartment some months before he died, and that I'd been meaning to return. I hadn't gotten around to it. Then I couldn't. I'd moved it once to wash it, then put it back on the same chair. It had become furniture in the way that objects belonging to dead people become furniture. Present, impossible to move, not quite real. The jacket was on the chair. There was something in the front pocket. I could see the outline of it. The pocket was full in a way it hadn't been before, a rectangular shape pressing through the fleece. I knew that pocket. I'd seen that jacket 100 times. The pocket had been flat. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Ward was sitting beside me, not pushing, not pulling, just there. I went to the chair. I reached into the pocket. It was a photograph, printed on regular paper, the way you print a photograph at home on a normal printer, slightly waxy, slightly oversaturated. The image was of Owen and me at what I recognized as our mother's backyard. Summer, probably 6 or 7 years ago. We were standing at the edge of the lawn near the garden she kept. Owen had his arm around me, and we were both squinting into the sun and laughing at something out of frame. I remembered the afternoon. I didn't remember this photograph being taken. On the back, in Owen's handwriting, "This one's mine. You can have it." I sat down on the edge of the bed. I'm going to try to describe what happened next without making it sound like more than it was, because the moment itself was quiet, and I don't want to add a texture to it that wasn't there. The temperature in the room didn't change. There was no light, no sound, no presence I could point to in any definable way. What happened was more interior than that. It was like, you know how sometimes you've been holding your shoulders up without realizing it, and then something releases and they drop, and you only understand you were tensed because you're not anymore? It was like that, but throughout my entire body, and also throughout something I don't have an anatomical word for. Something behind my chest. I sat on the edge of the bed with the photograph in my hands and I cried. Not dramatically. Not the kind of crying that comes with sounds and effort. Just tears and the specific kind of breathing that accompanies them. I cried for probably 10 minutes, and then I stopped, and I sat quietly for another 5. Ward came and put his head on my knee, not performing comfort, not anxious or reactive, just weight, just presence. I put my hand on the back of his head. After a while, I went back to the living room. I sat with the letter and the photograph side by side on the coffee table, and I looked at them. Carver had moved to the armchair, which he's technically not allowed on, and which he climbs onto whenever I'm distracted. I didn't tell him to get down. Here is where the story stopped being quiet. I was sitting there, both dogs in the room, everything settled, and I became aware that Ward had stood up again. He was at the front door this time, not scratching, not whining, standing, facing the door, in the exact orientation every adopter had described. Priya's voice. He wasn't waiting to go out. He was waiting to go somewhere specific. I watched him for a moment. He didn't look back at me. He was still. I thought about Carl's words. It has to be the dog who arrives. The whole thing has to happen on its own. And then, what he hadn't finished saying, the implication that after it happened, whatever it was, something was done. Completed. I thought about the two people Carl mentioned. He'd said they told him it was over, that they were okay. What did over mean if it had been building for 3 days, and the last thing had been a photograph in a jacket pocket and crying on my own bed? I stood up slowly. Ward didn't react. I went to the door. I put my hand on the knob. Ward stepped aside, just slightly, enough to let me get to the door, but not enough to suggest he was finished with it. He looked at the door. I said, "Are we going somewhere?" He looked up at me. I got my coat. I clipped his leash. I left Carver asleep in the armchair, because whatever this was, it wasn't for him that was a feeling I trusted, without being able to explain it. And I opened the door, and we went out. It was late, after 10. The street was quiet the way it gets on cold Sunday nights, when the temperature drops enough to keep people inside. My breath came out white. Ward walked at my left side, and he did not hesitate at the building door, did not hesitate at the sidewalk. He turned right. I let him lead with a loose leash, following without guiding, and he walked with the confidence of a dog who knows where it's going. Not pulling hard, not frantic, just purposeful, at an even pace, his nails quiet on the sidewalk. We walked 4 blocks. At the intersection of Crail and 9th, he turned left, 2 more blocks, then right down a short residential street I've walked dozens of times, a street of older houses with small yards, and he slowed. He stopped in front of a house I recognized, not because I had any connection to it, not because anything looked different about it. It was an ordinary house on an ordinary street, 2 stories, dark windows, a side yard with a dormant garden. Except I recognized it because I'd seen it once, 8 months ago from the outside, standing in front of it at 2 in the afternoon on a March day when I'd come to pick up some of Owen's things that his friend had held on to. It was the house of the friend Owen had been staying with the weekend before he died. Ward sat down on the sidewalk in front of it. He didn't pull toward the house. He didn't bark. He sat very still, and he looked at the dark front window, and then he looked up at me. I stood on the cold sidewalk and looked at the house where my brother had spent some of the last hours of his life, and I understood, in the way you understand something when your whole body agrees with it at once, that I'd never come here on purpose. I'd come that once to collect things, and I'd stood on this sidewalk for approximately 90 seconds, and I'd left. I'd never come back. I'd told myself it didn't matter. That place wasn't Owen. That Owen wasn't in any specific location anymore. What I had not told myself, because I hadn't let myself get to it, was that the last time I spoke to my brother, I'd been short with him. Not cruel, not a fight. Just short. I'd been tired, and he'd called at the wrong moment, and I'd kept it brief. 2 days later, he was dead, and the last thing I'd given him was brief. That's what I'd been holding. That's the specific thing. The weight Carl had gestured at when he'd said unfinished. The thing Owen had been trying to reach in the letter with whatever you're still carrying. I'd known it was there. I'd had it labeled and filed and had walked around it for 8 months without looking directly at it, because looking directly at it felt like the end of something. Ward was warm against my leg. The window of the house was dark. I stood on that sidewalk, and I said it out loud, quietly, into the cold air. I'm sorry I was short with you. Just that. Just those words. And then I stood there in the silence and waited to see if 8 months of wait was actually something that could be put down. That simply, or whether simple was just the shape it happened to take when it finally came. The cold was specific in the way December cold gets late at night, not dramatic, just settled, the kind that comes through your coat slowly and makes itself known in your hands first. I stood there long enough that my fingers went stiff around the leash. Ward didn't move. The house stayed dark. No one came to the window. No light changed inside. There was no sign of the friend. I didn't even know if she still lived there. I realized I didn't know her well enough to remember her last name. She and Owen had known each other through something, work, or a mutual person, and I'd met her once or twice, and that was all. Standing in front of her house at 10:15 on a Sunday night was not something I could explain to her if she looked out and saw me. But nothing happened. I said the words and they hung in the air, and then they didn't. The cold took them. I stood there, waiting for something to shift in the way the weight behind my chest had shifted in the bedroom. But it didn't. Not right away. And after a while, I understood that I wasn't going to receive a response I could measure. That was the whole point. Maybe. There was no transaction here. I'd said the thing into air that wouldn't hold it, and that was as close as I was going to get. Ward stood up, not urgently, just done. He turned away from the house and looked up the street, then back at me, and I understood he was ready to go home. I gave the house one more moment. I don't know what I was waiting for. I think I was just making sure I was finished. And then I turned, and we walked. He didn't lead on the way back. He walked at my side the way he'd walked every other time on a leash, at my pace, following my turns. That distinction registered. Going, he'd known the route. Returning, he deferred to me. Whatever the purpose of the walk had been, it was mine now, not his. We got back to the building and I took the stairs and let us in, and Carver was still in the armchair, asleep, one leg dangling off the edge. I unclipped Ward's leash and hung it on the hook by the door. I took my coat off. I stood in the entryway for a moment, feeling the warmth of the apartment come back into my hands. Ward went to the living room. He lay down near the window. Same position as the first night, head on paws, facing the glass. I sat on the couch and looked at the letter and the photograph on the coffee table. I didn't pick them up again. I just looked at them for a while. Then I moved the letter to the inside cover of one of Owen's books, the mountaineering one, because Owen had loved it specifically, and I wanted it kept somewhere it would be handled carefully. And I put the photograph on the shelf next to the one I already had of the two of us at our aunt's wedding. They looked right together. 2 different summers, 2 different versions of the same thing. I went to bed. Carver relocated from the armchair to the foot of the bed. Ward stayed in the living room. I slept without interruption for the first time in a long time. In the morning, everything was ordinary. Coffee, dogs out, back up. The slow metabolism of a Monday before work. Ward ate well. He and Carver moved around each other in the kitchen without incident. I kept waiting to feel different in some named way. And mostly, I just felt tired and quiet. The specific quietness that follows something that required more from you than you'd budgeted for. Not emptied out, More like after a long, necessary conversation, the kind where you say things you'd been storing, and then they're said, and you're still yourself. But the weight of the unsaid thing is gone. That's the most accurate description I have. I called Carl before I left for work. I told him what had happened, the letter, the photograph, the walk, the house, the words I'd said on the sidewalk. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it. I said, "Like I slept." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was close to one. He said he was glad. He asked about Ward. I said, "I think he's done." Carl said, "Yeah." I asked him if he wanted to come get him. There was a pause. He said, "What do you want to do?" And the honest answer was that I didn't know. The practical answer was that Ward was a dog who needed a home. I worked at a shelter. There were procedures for this. The other answer was that for 4 days, Ward had been in my apartment doing something I couldn't fully account for, and Carver had stopped standing in doorways, and a photograph had appeared in a pocket, and I had walked 4 blocks in December cold to stand in front of a house and say 6 words to the air. And I didn't know what Ward was or how any of that worked, and I wasn't sure the question of what was the right question anymore. I told Carl I'd call him later in the week. He said to take my time. At work, I pulled up Ward's foster file and sat with it. The formal options were straightforward: return to available, transfer to a partner rescue, or convert the foster to an adoption. I sat at my desk for a while with the file open and did not make a decision. Rena came by around 11 with a coffee for herself and asked how the foster was going. I said fine. She said he seemed like a good dog from what she'd seen. I said yeah. She looked at me for a moment. She has that quality of reading people without pushing. And then she said, "You look like you slept." I said, "First time in a while?" She nodded and moved on. I closed the file without changing anything. 3 days passed. Ward stayed. He fell into the apartment's routine in a way that was easy and undemanding. Walked in the mornings, fed, present in the background of whatever I was doing, occasionally near me, never insistent. He and Carver arrived at a kind of companionable equilibrium. Carver had the couch, Ward had the window. They ate at opposite ends of the kitchen without incident. On walks, Carver did his energetic sniffing, and Ward walked steadily at my side. Nothing unusual happened. No sounds, no smells, no temperature changes or objects in different places. I want to be honest about this part. I checked. Not obsessively, but I checked. I opened the closet. I looked at the boxes. I went through the remaining contents methodically the way I should have in the first place, probably. Nothing else was there that shouldn't have been. Owen's jacket pocket stayed empty. On the 3rd evening, I sat at the kitchen table after dinner and thought about what Carl had said during the adoption consultation. He stays with them until they've put it down. Or until they can't. I'd put it down, or I'd started to. The apology on the sidewalk was not the end of grief. I understood that. Grief doesn't end. It relocates. But it was the end of that specific suspension I'd been in. The standing at the door quality Owen had named in the letter. The waiting, without admitting I was waiting. What I was thinking about, sitting at the kitchen table, was the 3 adopters. Gerald, Teresa, Priya. Gerald, who said Ward looked at him like he was waiting. Teresa, who thought he was trying to tell her something, and trusted her feeling and brought him back. Priya, who recognized that the door staring wasn't about going outside, but about going somewhere specific. All 3 of them had given him back, and I'd kept thinking about that as a failure. Wrong people. Bad fit. But sitting there, I thought about it differently. None of them had been wrong people. They'd all read him accurately. They'd understood that something was being asked of them, and they'd made a clear-eyed decision that it wasn't theirs to give. That's not failure. That's a particular kind of self-knowledge. I was the destination because I was the one who needed it. That part I understood. What I hadn't let myself fully sit with was what that meant about Owen. Not Carl's role. Not Ward's mechanics. Not the physics of photographs appearing in jacket pockets. I'm genuinely not equipped to think about that part, and I've decided that's acceptable. But Owen's role. Owen, who had written that letter 4 months before he died, who had told Carl something I still don't have the full shape of, who had apparently arranged for a dog to find his way to me through 3 returned adoptions and a green nylon collar and a second line of engraving that Carl had put it there at Owen's instruction. Owen, who had known me well enough to know that direct delivery wouldn't work, that I'd receive a phone call from Carl and I'd listen carefully and document it and say I'd think about it, and then I'd manage it into a box and put it in a closet with the other boxes. He'd built a system for the specific structure of my stubbornness. That's the part that gets me. Not the supernatural mechanics of it, whatever those are. The fact that my brother knew me that precisely and loved me specifically enough to account for my worst tendencies. That's the thing I kept coming back to, sitting at the kitchen table on a Wednesday night in December, with both dogs nearby and Owen's jacket still on the chair in the bedroom. It took me a while to recognize what I was feeling. Not grief exactly, though grief was in it. Something warmer, something that felt almost like being seen. I called Carl on Thursday. I told him I wanted to keep Ward. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Okay." I asked him if that was the right thing to do, or if Ward needed to go somewhere else. He said he didn't think Ward needed anything specific anymore. He said, "I think that part's done. I think now he's just a dog." I said, "He's always been a dog." Carl said, "Yeah, but you know what I mean." I did. I asked Carl if he wanted to stay in contact. He said he'd like that. I said I thought Owen would have wanted him to know that the thing had worked, whatever the thing was. And Carl got quiet in a way that told me that mattered to him, and that he wasn't going to say so directly. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing in particular. The weather, the drive between our towns, whether the diner Owen used to meet him at was still open. It was, I told him. I'd been there a few times. He said maybe he'd come through sometime. I said that would be fine. I converted Ward's foster file to an adoption on a Friday. I did it at my own desk with my own employee records, and Rena countersigned as witness, because that's procedure for staff adoptions. She looked at the name on the form and said, "Ward, that's a good name." I said, "It came with him." She nodded like that was the most natural thing in the world. I took him home that evening in the same seat in the footwell, Carver in the back, the familiar 20-minute drive. He sat with the same orientation as the first night, looking forward through the windshield. When I parked and opened the door, he climbed out and waited on the sidewalk while I got Carver. And then we went upstairs. I have not heard any unexplained sounds since the Sunday night of the walk. The smell hasn't come back. The photograph is on the shelf. The letter is in the book. The jacket is still on the chair in the bedroom, and I've stopped meaning to move it. Ward sleeps near the window. Every morning, before anything else, he looks at me when I come into the living room, steady, brief, the way he always has, and then he looks away. And that's all. I've thought about whether he'll do this again. With me, I mean. Whether there's something still pending that he knows about. And I don't. I've watched him for any sign of the waiting quality the adopters described, and I don't see it. He seems, as Carl put it, like just a dog now. Present. Ordinary. accounted for. But I've also thought about what Carl said. He stays with them until they've put it down. Not until they've resolved it. Not until they've healed. Until they've put it down. I haven't fully put Owen down. I don't think you put people down in the permanent sense. Or not people who were this much a part of the structure of your life. What I've put down is the held breath. The standing at the door without naming the door. The 6 words I owed him that I was keeping instead of giving. That part is gone. The rest I'm carrying in the ordinary way, which is the only way there is. There's one more thing. About 2 weeks after I converted the foster file, I was doing intake on a Tuesday routine morning. Nothing unusual. And a woman came in with a found cat, a gray tabby, wet from the weather. Standard stray intake. I logged the cat, checked for a chip, checked the collar. The collar had a tag. I turned it over. It had an address on it. An address I didn't recognize, a street in the south part of town. A house number. A name I didn't recognize. Someone else's address. I stood in the intake room for a moment, holding that tag, and I thought about the morning I'd stood in the same room holding Ward's tag, and read my own address and thought, someone made a mistake. I logged the cat. I noted the address in the file as a potential owner contact. I did not look up the address. I did not try to find whose it was, or what they might be carrying. That's not my part of this. Whatever Carl's arrangement is, whatever Ward is, whatever the gray tabby might be, it doesn't need my documentation. It doesn't need me to manage it into a shape I can present. Some things work, whether or not you're watching them. Some things are better left to find their own way. I finished the intake. I went about my day. Ward was waiting for me when I got home that evening, near the window, his head up. He looked at me when I came through the door. I hung up my coat. I said hello to both dogs and got the leash from the hook. We went for a walk. The 3 of us, down the stairs and onto the street, into the ordinary winter evening that was just an evening. Nothing in it I couldn't name. Carver found something in a patch of dead grass and spent 45 seconds investigating it, which is his right. Ward walked at my side and didn't look back.